Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Tech Shift F9 podcast. I'm your host Maurizio, and this is the podcast that talks about career pivots, transformations, and interesting career paths with amazing guests. And I'm absolutely delighted to have this week on the show the one and only, the MVP of crypto, Kay Van Petersen, also known as KVP. KVP is managing partner at Ascent Capital. He's also executive advisor to the HODL Group and involved knee-deep in the world of crypto and beyond. KVP, it's a pleasure having you on the show.
Man, awesome to be on. And Mauricio, I can see the Italian in you coming up by, putting me on this incredible pedestal that I'll never be able to live up to. But, we do what we can, right?
Oh man, I've wanted to have you on the show for a while, as you know, ever since we met. I think when you meet people and you feel there is a connection, you gotta make the most of it, and that's what I felt when I connected with you. And what I love about your background, Kay, is that you've gone through something similar to me, like traditional finance. You've done it not just in your home country in Denmark, but you went to London, you went to Hong Kong, Singapore. So you've seen the international aspect of finance and some really important roles. I mean, you basically went through the ranks and became global macro specialist at one of the largest financial institutions, particularly in the fintech space. And what I really would like to understand from these early parts of your career is why finance? And what did you find about yourself in your career path in finance in those early years?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's this great game of life, right? That we're all playing, some better than others. And, some sitting in the proverbial crowd, and actually very few of us, I feel, in the actual arena. So, by quick kind of background, I'm an emerging market kid. So I'm half Danish, half Kenyan, but, born and raised in Africa, born and raised in the East Africa, on the slopes of Mount Elgon, as I like to say. And, came from relatively kind of humble beginnings. We weren't that wealthy. And I think from a very young age, I was very fascinated with why is it that this family on this side of the street has way more than this family on the other side of the street. And that
Right.
kind of really drove me towards finance. It was just understanding, the sequence of decisions, framework, systems. I didn't even understand what that was at the time, but it was that curiosity, right? Of why some people were doing better off than others. And I'd always known from a very, very young age I wanted to do something in finance. I wasn't exactly sure what it was. I never had the mental model, as you and I talked about in Dubai early on this year, of even being an entrepreneur. I didn't even know what that really kind of meant, right? So, I was one of these people that saw the original Wall Street, and, just wanted to be, the next Gordon Gekko. Like there was something beautiful about, being a self-made person coming from nothing, against
Absolutely.
kind of all odds. And that's really what kind of drove me kind of into it, right?
Fantastic. And Kay, when you had your first steps in finance, um, obviously it was at a time where there were a lot of changes, the markets were hot, but you ended up being um, quite specialized in the world of equities, and you looked at it from different perspective, from the M&A side, from the trading side. Has that given you a perspective on value and how to look at relative value, opportunities, investments? And I don't say that just professionally. Perhaps there was an element of that analytics that came into your own professional career, perhaps.
Yeah, man. And as we jammed in Dubai, man, I really think it's all symmetrical to life, right? I think it's all the same. So principles, frameworks, mental models that you discuss, let's say in trading or in investing, or even in a special situation kind of takeover, are kind of the same one in also life, as a whole. I was, fortunate, I suppose, in hindsight. It never seems like it at the time, but to have gone through almost every part of a bank. I started my quote unquote career as it's called a studentmedarbeiter. It's a kind of like a permanent internship at Danske Bank, which was the biggest bank in Scandinavia, and it was a rotating internship. So by the time I got to London, in 2007. I'd pretty much seen every part of the bank except, M&A, corporate finance. So I'd done research, different asset classes, different strategies, derivatives, FX, macro, sat with the trading desks down in Copenhagen, mortgage-backed bonds, currencies, govies, sat with the treasury desk, sat on the ECM side, even sat with private equity. So M&A was the last area, corporate finance, that I'd never really been. And at the time, I joined a very little known firm called Jeffries. I was headhunted to it. I thought it was a bakery when I first heard the name. Obviously, now it's a lot more well known because this is all pre-Bear and pre-Lehman. Um, and to your point, I think it's quite interesting, right? And quite fascinating how things play out. Because at Jeffries, I was given the choice of joining four teams on the investment banking side. It was
Right.
tech, it was media, it was oil and gas, and it was a brand new team called transportation and infrastructure. And that's the one I joined. And the honest truth, Mauricio, is if I joined the other three, I would probably still be in London and be an MD and still be in corporate finance, right? But as it was, I chose the latter, the new team. The MD that originally hired me left. And after that, I rotated to the prop trading side. This is February 12th, 2008. So right before the subprime crisis. I'd never really run any money before. So I was pure bottoms up, fundamental
Mm-hmm.
kind of geek, thinking that the model speaks the truth, because that's what I'd led to be believed by, business, applied economics and finance, from a master's perspective from CBS. And of course, the subprime crisis definitely had something else to teach me, right? You've not really traded till you see the S&P move up and down by 5% intraday, right?
Oh,
So you can
yes.
imagine what single stocks are doing. But to your point, what I got out of that, and then ended up in Hong Kong on the hedge fund side, then ended up in Singapore on a macro cross asset strategist consigliere role, is I learned a lot from being able to do the bottoms up, being able to do the tops down, and understanding kind of I guess you could say, the significance of meta trends, then macro, and then optionality. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I wouldn't have stumbled into crypto if I didn't have a special sits event driven background, right? Because when I read the white paper in 2012, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's super obvious Bitcoin was going to be here and crypto was going to be 2.5 trillion, in the second quarter of 2024, right? And it's going to be an asset class that eventually is going to be 100 trillion. It wasn't. It was not obvious at all back then. But what was obvious was Pascal's wager, right? Which, as you and I know, is basically an asymmetrical kind of think piece. And I always like to invert Pascal's wager from the context of saying, like, if you can't get comfortable being long, would you short it? Right. And if the answer is no, then you definitely have to be long. Right. So that's really how I initially got in. And then as I just dug deeper, and even as I continue to this day, this is over 10 years, it just keeps blowing my mind. So there's no doubt that thinking from the finance side really, really helped. And also in regards to, applications and just also life and decision making in general. Right.
We'll dig into that a little bit more, and obviously about your crypto experience. But I want to focus on that period of time, which is about 10 years, right, that you spent in Asia in financial institutions between Hong Kong and Singapore. So there's you, half European, half African, who've had experience living and working in different contexts. You move to Hong Kong, then Singapore. You're thrown in very different cultures at a time in your career where you're sort of started to establish yourself and get to senior positions. How was that management of such a different environment, and how did you, some of the challenges you had, how did you handle them? What are some of the things that you've learned not to do again, perhaps, in that kind of context?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know how easy it is to answer that because, I think also, as you and I said, a lot of this, when you enter a career, especially one that's super cyclical, right? Like finance. So there's a cyclicality element of it. Where's the economy? Are we about to enter a bull market? Are we coming out of one, as was the case when I got to London in 2007? I mean, that was literally the peak, right? There was probably no worse time to kind of enter kind of finance, to be very honest, right? And I think a lot of the, really making money hand over fist years were very much behind. So that definitely has had a skew, right, on anyone who's come into the industry. As an example, if you came in and started to trade from 2009, you always bought the dip and you pretty much made money, up until COVID without fail, right?
Hmm.
So when you enter a specific profession in a specific industry, based on the cycle, it can has huge ramifications, right? Either tailwinds wise or headwind wise, and it actually ends up being a much bigger multiplier than quote unquote how smart you are, what school you came out of, so on and so forth. I of course had no appreciation of this at the time, right? I just knew I was the hardest worker in the room. I was always wired to be, all in or nothing. Functional psychopath, as I like to say
Hmm.
it. The really rude awakening, but it seems so naive for me to look back and actually say, well, hold on, like what's really happening here, right? So what I focused on, and I think the general blueprint most of us have that is kind of indoctrinated into us, is to play the game as best as we can, to become the best at playing the game. But we never stop to ask, what game do you want to play, right? And that's something that I just did not appreciate at the time. So it was very much a rude awakening, to be very honest, right? Because all of this coming to Hong Kong, when she moved to Singapore, like these were all kind of driven by need for career changes, right? Or having been let go from a role, or different kind of things in that way. So uh, as we were talking about, like, how did I end up doing what I'm doing? Like, I had to find a way. Like, the only superpower I have is being relentless, and I think that's really part and parcel of the human kind of spirit, right? Always going forward, always optimizing, but learning, as much as you can, kind of from the past. And just to underline this point, and you and I will have known this, right? I'm sure you've seen this a lot of times. If you round up a whole bunch of long short uh, portfolio managers, right? And you kind of stack them out on, who's really creating alpha versus noise, and it's the tech guys who are always on top. And you have to wonder how much of that is that them, or how much of it is that they pick the right sector, right, to go to be PMs in. And I think that's what's often mistaken for in life, is there's actually other forces, right, that are happening, that are not as clear, and then we tend to, perhaps give too much credit to those who are really successful, and actually say, wait a minute, we actually take that same person and put them in this other sector, they'd be eating dirt, right, and vice versa, right? So again, what game do you want to play, right?
I couldn't agree more, and I think we overestimate the ability to control things. Um, Having said that, once you are in a position where you're now fairly senior on a desk on a trading floor like you were, you there are other elements about work beyond being a subject matter expert, beyond being the hardest worker in the room. It's really about how you relate to others, how you play some of the political games, how to hire people. And uh, I'm curious, how has your learning and your experience been in those areas? And how did you handle it? And maybe looking back a few years, were there some things that you wish you'd done a little bit differently?
Well, probably it's not going to surprise you or any of your listeners that I'm about as straightforward as they get, right? I wear my heart on my sleeve. It's how we're wired in this family. And it definitely probably has not served me well in the traditional corporate environment of politics, right? I think that's also the thing about, once you start to run money, it's very hard to kind of go back, because there is no more honest work, right? At the end of the day, the P&L is the P&L, right? You can't create a story or whatever. It is the mark to market. And then it's very hard to, I think, play that kind of political game. And I think that's the paradox, is a lot of the leadership in the world, a lot of the CEOs, they're actually not really good at the underlying task. What they excel at is playing that kind of political game. So I definitely did not necessarily maybe network as much as I could have, kiss butt as much as I should have, or so on. But, I completely don't regret that. Could I have stayed in places longer and maybe moved up? Yeah, for sure. But, like, I think you have one life, as far as we know, YOLO. And especially now that also, I'm a sapien of two young sapiens, or as I like to call them, two young allocations in the venture portfolio. I really want to be able to tell them something that I'm also living, right? And I think also a lot of this is just maybe just a sequence of the places I worked. And maybe if we ran the simulation a few other times. I'd have been in other places, and completely that's exactly what was being looked for. But I tend to find, and I think you probably agree with this, it's unfortunately a little bit too true. You know, all these work cultures all say they want honesty, they want meritocracy, and they want the best of the best, but it's just not the truth, right? What ends up being is there's an incumbent, it's either their way or the highway. There's some rare exceptions where this is not kind of the case. And you can find this in like even, hedge funds, right? Which should be the epitome of meritocracy, right? You can find this in prop desk teams, which again should be the epitome of meritocracy. And I think this is also like when you see the dominance that, let's say, point 72, right? Slash, XSAC, Millennium, etc. And it's amazing. These are the same names we've been talking about for decades. And
Right.
you'd think, wow, this should be an easy model to replicate and surpass. But no, it's not, right? Because of all of these elements that just we as sapiens tend to kind of complicate it by how we are engineered and wired, right?
So KVP, you then had a come to the light moment. I think professionally speaking, although you were interested in crypto from a long time ago, you actually started working in that area, and you've been, involved with the HODL Group, with some of your own activities. I just would like to understand what made you want to make that switch, and has it lived up to its expectations?
Yeah, so I'd always wanted to make the switch for a long time, like all the way going back to the 2017 cycle. Um, but I just couldn't get comfortable on how to do it. As I said, I never had the entrepreneurial blueprint, right? Um, and I just kept thinking with this old blueprint, let me go work for someone or with someone. That was kind of my MO. And everyone I was speaking to at the time, I was in Singapore, Asia at the time. There's no real business models, man. You'd ask four questions in, and it was just like get rich as soon as you can, and
Hmm.
that's it, right? You got to remember this was also the breeding grounds of the like of the three crooks or three arrows of Luna, right? The like of Celsius, like this that was the environment they came out of. Like I'm not surprised by those blowups or some of those people. So I just couldn't get comfortable of who to cross over to work with. I didn't feel that I had a strong enough, let's say, technical background to code or write a protocol or think about that way. And I think it's like a lot of things. There's the idea, but it still takes time to figure out your place and your kind of role. So, the HODL Group was, almost like a dream kind of come true. I continue to this day think they're one of the best kept secrets in the space. The more I looked into them, the more I just, thought it was complete made up and fairy dust until I had to fly in and, stay in the HQ in Rotterdam for 16 days, come in on the weekends, make sure everyone's real. And there
Good due
are people like
diligence.
this. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Full DD. Remember, I'm an ex special sits event driven merger arb guy, man. Like, if there's one thing we honed out of that, it's DD. So it's just great to be, an investor there. It's great to be an executive strategic advisor to the board, help them on big picture strategy, international expansion, biz dev, and actually to have a board who, they say they want to hear, potent, visceral, applicable, advice, and they put it into motion, to their credit. Again, one of these things, right, where one person says one thing, but it's rarely the case that that's actually what they want to do. So that's been incredible, and it's great to be now part of the ecosystem and not just, let's say, an investor, right? So we have Reform, which is launching tail end of April, early May. I'm a core contributor there. I'm also an investor. We're one of the biggest market makers in the world. And I have two pools of capital. One is allocated to HODL, and the other one, of course, run through Ascent Capital. And I've just never been happier, right? From being able to go knee deep into the weeds and have people that I want to bat for, right, and who want to bat for me.
So, how's that part of your work changed in the sense of now you're obviously freer to do what you want to do. That's the nice position to be in. Obviously,
Yeah,
it's very different from starting off as a 22-year-old at a bank that where you just follow the protocols. But
yeah.
with that freedom, comes responsibility, the Spider-Man view of the world in terms of you now are your own entrepreneur. You are much more focused on what you're doing. And how have you helped yourself in terms of, learning how to do these things? It's just by doing. Have you invested some time in courses and finding out about best practices? And I ask that because as we get older, let's be honest, it gets a little bit harder to learn. I mean, you got to have an open mind. You have it clearly, but it's a little bit harder to get away from the mental models that we've built over the 20, 30 years prior.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a story that, you're telling yourself or you're citing, right? And that's not from a judgment. That's just an observation from my side. So I think, when whatever age we are, there's a certain story, or more probably accurately, there's a layer cake of different stories that we tell ourselves. Um, a lot of these are indoctrined. We've read, we've absorbed, we went to school for it. A lot of them are kind of through experience. And most of the times we don't even know what these stories are, right? It's almost like, silent kind of code, subconscious, works as a whole. I've always been very, very adamant to keep trying improving myself. And I don't think this even is about, you know, finance. This is going from any job, because the thing that a job does very well is it gives you structure, right? There's certain hours, a certain time. You get these days off a year. There's insurance. There's maybe even a pension attached to it. Blah 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 blah. But you pay a price for that, right? Um, and some people may be happy with that, and others not. And of course, it's also a function of who's the firm, who are you working with, right? So there's a lot of moving parts, and I don't necessarily think that one's better than the other, right? I definitely think that some people are more geared towards being an entrepreneur, but it's also definitely not for everyone. So I will say this: the hardest part is, especially when you're, you know, geared towards me towards being extreme, is creating a structure of just not working 24/7, right? Because that's obviously not sustainable. But it's not too different from running a book, because you're never off, right? You could always do more. But also, as in with running a book, you have to put in times when you're off. You have to put in times for, part of working is not working, part of training is not training. We don't have a history of entrepreneurship, in recent family side. I think my grandfather on the Danish side was a butcher. On the African side was a cab driver or a matatu driver. So I've just been basically creating and making it up as we kind of go along, which any entrepreneur will tell you that's probably honestly what they're doing, right?
Fair
So
enough.
I think most importantly is you got to take care of the main asset. What's the main asset? It's yourself, right? So if you're not sleeping right, if you're not training, if you're not eating right, you are basically not setting up you yourself as the main asset for success. This is an important point, right? Because what's the point of working 120-hour weeks for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and then you're dead, right? Or whatever it is,
True,
right?
true.
So I think that's important, because that has a multiplier effect. So for me personally, martial arts, I'm a big runner. I do a lot of Muay Thai. I have a background in jiu-jitsu. It's pretty hot now in Southeast Asia, so the ice baths are coming in, doing that 3 times a week. I do a lot of meditation. I do a lot of journal. I probably do a little bit too much, but that's also kind of how I'm wired. But this helps with, basically grounding yourself, anxiety, in some cases maybe depression, and it overall helps your decision making. So that's the most important thing you do have when you are running your own show, ship, however you want to kind of think about it. And then again, you have to find what works for you, right? As well, there is no, I think, one size kind of fits all camp, as a whole. I've always felt the most successful people in life are those who are living the lifestyle that they want to live, but are also, finding, an ability to thrive and doing what they want to do, spending time with family, loved ones, and maybe some form of giving back or hobby or something like that. Right? That to me is true success. I think you and I know a lot of people who are, millionaires on paper, have big roles, running crazy amounts of money, but actually a lot more, let's say, chained than they've ever been, right? As a whole, and that to me is not success. So I think you just gotta, take a step back and just really define, what does success look like, to you? Do you want to compound and play your average day over the next 10, 20, 30 kind of years? And if not, then you probably have to get back to the drawing board, right?
Absolutely. KVP, before we sign off, I wanted to ask about how you handle the crypto kids and the crypto heads that you deal with every time. And I say that a little bit jokingly, but in the sense that, it's a new industry and it attracts all sorts of different people, which is one of the reasons why it is so interesting. But at the same time, it can create a little bit of friction, a little bit of frustration, particularly for someone that may have, like yourself, long experience in financial markets. And so, how do you relate to some of these fringes of the crypto market?
I think it's a pretty broad, big question, but I think I get what you're trying to say. I think, you always have to understand every generation is different. I'm pretty sure, your parents, my parents, our grandparents were looking at us coming up and being like, "Oh man, these are some
That's right.
lost causes," right? So I don't think that ever changes, right? I think at the end of the day, this is the sapient experience. You also, I think, had to see a lot of these, and we're stereotyping here because this is maybe predominantly Western, predominantly kind of rich countries. They've been brought up in, a conspiracy of environments, or should I say, a contradictory kind of environment where they have so much, but at the same time, so much is stacked against them, right? From the context of, if you were just to start out in, I don't know what the situation is in Japan, but if you were to start out in the US or even let's say Singapore, and you look what the average salary is before tax, and you look at the price of, let's say, buying a property, getting married, having family, it's a very, very different environment, right?
Yeah.
From, generations kind of previously the case. And I think it's very, very hard for people of like, earlier vintages to really appreciate that. And this is actually what we're seeing literally expressed in crypto. And I think it's here to stay in the meme tokens, right? Because it seems irrational and it seems, dumb as hell that people are
Hmm.
going out there and putting their life savings or, whatever they're earning out of a paycheck into a token called Toshi or Meow or Pepe or Bonk or whatever. But actually, if you think about it, it's actually completely rational because when you kind of have nothing left to believe in, you believe in anything. And it's actually better than, let's say, playing the lottery, right? Which is, I don't know, 300 million to one, whatever the odds kind of are. And here you actually could potentially affect your odds by participating, by being part of the ecosystem, by being part of, this digital kind of tribe and, talking up your kind of token. And it's also a big middle finger, I think, to the establishment. So I think one of the key things you have to remember is a big part of this generation, and this is like a good problem. Don't get me wrong, right? If you're in the EM, like you're just trying to eat today, right? You don't
Yeah.
have time to think about
Hmm.
living a thriving life, right? But I think in kind of the quote unquote richer kind of countries, at least relatively, it's a big issue because the societal trust has been broken. The social contract has been broken. The social contract is you and I pay taxes, right, to whatever sovereign we're in, and there's opportunities. We can work hard and we can move ahead, and that's just not possible anymore, right? The degradation in wealth. I was on the U.S. Labor of Statistics site, and $1 million in 2008. Basically, to have the same equivalent purchasing power today, you need 1.5 billion. Or to put it differently, your $1 million is now worth 500, right? That's huge. Like, so and that's of course also why HODL, why a lot of DGens and also TradFi guys are looking at kind of crypto because it seems to be the one asset class that at least you can't come in and quadruple the denominator, right, as you can in the fiat world. So I guess it's a long way of saying you also have to look at the environment they're coming from, right?
Of course.
They have so much, but at the same time, they've been set so far behind the starting goal that it's at. So I suppose that's a way of saying empathy. Don't judge. I try not to judge anybody. It's not easy. We're
Hmm.
engineered to judge, right? Um, and then I just try and when I'm interacting with them, one of the big things I've noticed, and you've probably seen this. I mean, man, me and you coming up in the deaths, dude. You get shit thrown at you, you get
All the
abused.
time.
It's like Monday morning. You're not even sat down, right? You know what I mean? And you already got shit. So, a big one I get is like, they can't take critique, and I've definitely noticed that, right? I've yet to hear. I'm maybe paraphrasing here. Like, you know what? It was my fuck up. Sorry, this. It's very kind of like, oh, I'm learning. Oh yeah, so you do get issues kind of maybe like that. That's kind of different, but you also have to look at it as like, okay, maybe you and I weren't exactly brought up in the most conducive environment. For every Mauricio and KVP that's here, how many people are like in the basement shivering, right, from being
Totally.
damaged off of trading desks or kitchens or tech rooms or whatever it kind of is. So there's a little bit of a survivorship bias, and I think a lot of the judgment, right? Um, and you have to think about that. But I think empathy, sticking with principles, giving your analogy, and if it's a really heart to heart kind of conversation, you have to then go and say how you feel. So you have to deconstruct the action rather than, of course, the individual. This is not too dissimilar to having kids, right? Same thing, or a partner, right?
Totally agree. KVP, it's been great having you in the show. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Great to be on, Mauricio. Take care.
Well, folks, that's the end of another episode. Thank you for listening. Stay cool, stay positive.